Hi everyone, I'm Chauncey Nebula, and today let's talk about Blood and Plunder, and some reasons why you should play it, and some reasons why maybe you shouldn't. As I did for my Star Wars Legion, reasons why you should and shouldn't play video, I'm going to do one positive and then one negative to try to be as balanced as possible, and I'm going to be as objective as possible, and then afterwards I'll tell you a little bit about what I think. Well, I suppose that this entire video is what I think, but there will be some closing remarks. So let's just jump right in. The first positive is that there are multiple play experiences. Not only are there a lot of different scenarios to play, but there are three ways that you can kind of play the game. You can play the game either as a land scenario, you can play the game as an amphibious scenario, so ships and land, or you can play as an all-sea scenario, so all ship combat, boarding action, etc. The incredible diversity of scenarios and the very different play experience of land, amphibious, and sea means that you can always keep Blood and Plunder fresh. It's a game that is very flexible, and it's very easy to come up with your own scenarios if for any reason you get bored with the scenarios that come in the rulebooks. The first con is the models. They're not bad. I am going to tell you, there are not bad models. But currently, as of the filming of this video, the only models you can get for Blood and Plunder are metal for the infantry and resin for the ships. That will change in approximately October of 2021 when the Kickstarter Raise the Black releases. This is the new expansion for Blood and Plunder, and it will be moving fully into plastic. So if you don't like metal models and you don't like resin models, just wait a little bit and you'll be fine. Now, for myself, the resin ships look great. They do require a little bit of work. There are sometimes some bubbles or some flash. You do have to trim it a little bit. Of course, if you're doing that, always wear a mask. You do not want to inhale resin dust. That is really bad for you. And the metal models are honestly pretty good. There will be warped guns, warped swords, all this stuff. Well, I don't know if warped is the right word. Bent, certainly. When I unboxed some filibustiers, they were, the gun went like this, and then it just went straight down. It was a 90-degree angle, pretty much. And when you're working with metal models, breaking them is a very real concern. The other thing is the resin ships, while high quality on the whole, I certainly wouldn't want to drop them because they're pretty heavy, and if I dropped them, I am very concerned that they would break or at the very least crack and or have the paint chip. The same is kind of true for the metal models. They weigh a lot, so if you drop them, they're more likely to have a piece bend, they're more likely to have a piece break, they're more likely for the paint to chip off. In general, this is why plastic is a superior material for many people. But in terms of resin models and metal models, Firelock Games has done a good job. The second pro is something that is very important to me, which is historical accuracy. Blood and Plunder is a historical war game, and as such, it draws its inspiration and content from real people, real events, real objects. And as such, they have been very, very careful to be as historically accurate as possible with their models. Of course, if you don't like this style, this very historically accurate style, you prefer the more pop culture, pirates and Age of Sail sort of thing, very flamboyant, very colorful, a very Pirates of the Caribbean sort of thing, then maybe this isn't the game that has the aesthetic that you want. You might want to go looking for something else. But if you want a game that is very historically accurate, this is the game that will make you happy. The other thing, as part of this historical accuracy, is they've kept the flavor of the time within the rules. The way that they work with range, the way that they work with ship movement, it feels very authentic. It feels very real. That, you're a pirate. You don't have the best equipment. You maybe don't have the best aim. You're not that well trained, probably. But despite that, there is a very good line that Blood and Plunder manages to tread between too historically accurate and too balanced. Because if you go too far in one direction, then it's really historically accurate, but the game is difficult to play and can often get bogged down in rules. But if you go for the more streamlined rules that's really balanced, that's really competitive, then you're often going to lose a lot of the historical accuracy and flavor. Blood and Plunder manages to toe that line right down the middle very, very well, and it's something that I really appreciate. The second con is rulebooks, namely the fact that in October we will be getting the third one. Now, these are not replacements. There is the base rulebook, and then there is No Peace Beyond the Line, which is an expansion book but contains rules that you're going to want. And then when Raise the Black releases, there will be the Raise the Black rulebook. And you will be able to buy, and you can buy now, a rulebook that has all the rules contained in it. But if you're not able to find those, you're going to have to buy 3 separate rulebooks. Now, having expansion books, that's not really a big deal. Most games do this in some form or another, but it's a lot of stuff to lug around. With Blood and Plunder, you have your infantry, and, that in and of itself, not that hard to transport. You have your activation deck. Again, it's a deck of cards. It's not that hard to transport. But if you have some larger ships, then that adds a great deal of bulk. And then if on top of that you have to cart around 1, 2, 3 rulebooks, the rulebooks are not necessarily small. The core rulebook is not too large, but the No Peace Beyond the Line is pretty hefty, and I'm not really sure how big Raise the Black is going to be. But if you have to lug around 3 rulebooks on top of, maybe a larger ship, and your infantry models, and your cannons, and you might have to transport your rigging for your ships separately, and then you have to transport your activation cards, and your dice, and a tape measure, the added bulk of the rulebooks does kind of make this game a little bit more unwieldy to transport, and also a lot more unwieldy to store. Now, as a side note to this, the rulebooks are very nice. They're good quality. I keep mine on my shelf. They're just in with my books. They have nice art. They have nice paper. They are nice rulebooks, and I appreciate nice rulebooks. They're not some cheap thing. So, yeah, you do have to have a good number of rulebooks, but they're pretty nice. The third pro is the factions. There are a lot of factions in Blood and Plunder. There are a lot of even factions within the English. There's the English super faction, but then there are English pirate hunters and, English militia. There's all these different factions, all the way down to the Scottish in the unaligned and peripheral powers. And each of these factions feels very unique. They have their own identity. They have their own units that they can take. Certain units for some factions are core units, some are support, and you can't have more than 50% of your force be support units. And some of them have unique commanders. In fact, a lot of them have unique commanders. Even if they don't have a unique historical commander mini, they'll have a commander that's like, well, you use the generic English commander as this commander. So you have a lot of options for list building, and each of those factions does feel very individual. They have their own flavor. Personally, I love playing the unaligned factions. I love playing Brethren of the Coast, I love playing Pirates, and I love playing Logwood Cutters. And even just within these 3, pirate factions, because these are all factions comprised of ne'er-do-wells, these all play very, very differently. So, in Blood and Plunder, even if you decide you only want to collect English, or you only want to collect the French or the Dutch, there's still a lot that you can do within that using the same models. And that, combined with that unique feel and flavor of each of these factions, means that Blood and Plunder is a game that, again, can stay very fresh for a very long period of time. The third con is, once again, in relation to the rules, but not their physical size. Rather, it's the fact that the rules can sometimes be kind of squirrely. What I mean by that is that sometimes you'll come across something that is a little bit difficult to understand. Sometimes you'll have to go hunting in the rulebook for a good amount of time to find the answer to something because you would think, oh, it's in this section, but then it ends up being in another section. And you can spend, especially if you're not as familiar with the game or you don't play the game terribly often, a lot of time reading the rules. You can spend a lot of time hunting through the rule books. Now, I fully recognize that it is difficult to both produce a very good rule set and then also have it written in a way that is clear, concise, easy to understand, and that's easy to find the answer that you want. That is very difficult, and I think a lot of people who are miniature wargamers tend to forget that these are real people who have to put this together, and as humans are not infallible, neither will the rulebooks. When you're playing a game like from Games Workshop, like, a Warhammer 40k or an Age of Sigmar or a Kill Team or something, they have huge teams of people that contribute to making sure that the rules are designed and laid out as perfectly as possible. As a result, it ends up having very clear rules. If you have a question about how something works for a Games Workshop game, you can open the rulebook and within seconds you'll have your answer. But Firelock Games, the company that makes Blood and Plunder, is not Games Workshop. They don't have that huge team of people to do that. As a result, the rules are not as perfectly laid out as perhaps they could be given infinite time and manpower. However, the rules are well written. It is a good rule set, but it is true that because there's a lot of stuff that you can do in Blood and Plunder, and there's a lot of different ways that things interact, sometimes the rules can be a little bit unclear. In my experience, if you have a question about rules, you just go online and you ask in the Blood and Plunder forums of your choice or on a Facebook group, and you'll get an answer. This is a game with a really vibrant community that loves helping each other. This is one of the most positive communities I've ever come across in any sort of gaming. If you have a question, there will be someone who knows the answer, and they will be happy to explain it to you. So, yeah, the rules are sometimes squirrely, and that's a con. That is a definite con. But if you're willing to reach out, it's not that big of a deal. The next pro, being the fourth, is that the way the game is designed, proxies are in many ways encouraged. In fact, Firelock Games does not make a mini for every single thing that they have in their game. In fact, many of the special characters don't have an official mini. So you have to make your own. A great example of this is the musician and the spiritual leader, both of which I use frequently in my games. And because of the way that they design the minis and the fact that in those times attire was not standardized even for armies, for the most part, you can take a French unit and field it as an English unit, and it'll be totally fine. And in fact, with Raise the Black, they are moving away a little bit from faction-specific minis, like minis designed to be this unit in this faction, and they're instead going towards soldiers, sailors, cavalry, etc. These kind of generic model types that are modular. You can build them with lots of different heads, lots of different guns, etc., and you can essentially field them as whatever you want. Blood and Plunder is a game that allows a lot of freedom. So even if you primarily play English, you can take your army and play them as Spanish. To me, that flexibility to do what you want with or without the official minis is fantastic. That is an approach that I have not seen in any other tabletop game. And it's wonderful. The fourth con is actually related to the fourth pro, which is that some models just don't have minis. And sometimes that can suck. If you're like me and you love playing with the spiritual leader, I love this character. He goes into most every force that I build. There's no specific model for him. As a result, I have a 3D printed one. But if you don't have a 3D printer and you can't find a model from a third-party company that you like, it can sometimes be a little bit disheartening because now you're kind of out of luck. The fact that not every mini in the game actually exists in official form is both very freeing and kind of a pain at times, because it means that you have to do extra work to obtain the figure for the character or mini that you want. Now, granted, if you have a 3D printer, or if you're willing to go out and look for a little bit, it's not that big of a deal. What I will say is that it is hard to find appropriate minis that are not 3D printed. What I see a lot of people do is they grab Warlord Games minis and they put them into their Blood and Plunder forces as standard bearers, musicians, etc. The problem is Warlord Games minis are considerably smaller than Firelock Games Blood and Plunder minis, and it's noticeable. Now, if you just want to say, well, this is a smaller person, okay, they're half a foot shorter than their peers. It happens. But at the same time, when the rest of your army is all the same height, and then there's that one guy that's considerably shorter, you really notice it. It's very obvious. So it is something to keep in mind, that you may have to do work in order to just find a suitable replacement for something that's not actually officially made. That said, find someone for a spiritual leader. If you're going to play Blood and Plunder, the spiritual leader is fantastic. I love Brethren of the Coast with the spiritual leader. It's great. I love Logwood Cutters with the spiritual leader. Any faction can make great use of the spiritual leader. Just look at the rules and find a mini for it. Just do it. It always pays off for me. The fifth pro is something that may not last once we move from metal and resin into plastic, but I feel like it might, and that is ease of army building. Specifically, the physical building of your army. With metal models and resin ships, everything's pre-assembled. You can take your army out of the box. You'll want to wash it first to get the resin dust and mold release powder off of your ships and your infantry, but it's very easy to just dunk them in warm water, straighten out those swords and those rifles, prime them, and paint them. There's a lot less work that kind of goes into it than, say, building a Warhammer army or a Star Wars Legion army, where you have to get out the sprues, clip the pieces off the sprues, file off the mold lines, glue them together. It's a whole separate set of several hours of building just to get to the point where you can paint it. Blood and Plunder right now doesn't have that, and from what I've seen of the plastic models, they're not going to be that big of a deal to build. For myself, I have tons and tons of stuff to build and tons of stuff to paint, and I love saving time. So when I see a model that is really simple to build, even if it's not simple to paint, if it's simple to build, I really like that. Because, to be perfectly honest, it sometimes takes me more time to build something than it does to paint it. If I can eliminate steps and just have it be an easy-to-build thing or not have to build it at all, that's fantastic. Again, it may not turn out to be simple once plastic is released, but I kind of believe it will. The fifth con is the question that's on everyone's mind when they hear about a new wargame. How much does it cost? And right now, the answer for Blood and Plunder is a little bit depressing. The game is great, and the infantry are not terribly expensive. Right now, they did raise their prices, but right now, it's not the worst I've ever seen. That said, if you want to play a larger, say, sea game, and you want to field the galleon, which is the biggest beast of a ship in the game, it's awesome. but it's $300, at least before they raised their prices. I don't know what it is now. And not only do you have to buy the ship, and the ships are expensive, but you have to buy the infantry to effectively crew them, because you not only have to have models to operate the cannons and the swivel guns, but you also need you also need infantry available to change the sails and to turn and stuff. You know, you need a lot of models on deck sometimes with a lot of these bigger ships in order to just play the game. And as a result, any size game above like a smaller size often ends up being more expensive than I think a lot of people are going to be comfortable with, especially considering that the models are plastic and the ships are resin, which a lot of people just don't like. Now, I will say that I believe it will be a lot less expensive once plastic rolls around, because plastic ships are going to be a lot less expensive than resin ships. Resin ships are expensive because resin is expensive. Plastic is not as expensive. Plastic as a material is a lot cheaper. Also, in the boxes of infantry, yeah, you might pay, $15, but there's going to be a lot of models in that box. And you're probably going to have a lot of spare parts afterwards, so eventually you'll be able to just build your own models out of stuff you have just lying around. That said, currently, as of the filming of this video, I am reluctant to buy a lot of product because it is spendy. So those are the 5 reasons for and the 5 reasons against playing Blood and Plunder, or 5 reasons that you should play Blood and Plunder and 5 reasons that you should be aware of, maybe. It's not super you should play this game or you shouldn't play this game. It's just stuff to keep in mind. But I want to now talk about my experience with Blood and Plunder, because this is a game that is extremely different from most other games that I've played. First of all, it's by a smaller company, but the quality is fantastic. The people who make Blood and Plunder are clearly much better at game design and much better at product design than pretty much most other companies. And I don't know whether it's because it's small, so it ends up being more of a labor of love, but whatever they're doing correctly. Blood and Plunder is also one of the few games that I won't rag on. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, you see, when I was in college, I was a double major in English and history. And in history, I did a lot of military history. And I studied a lot the time period in which Blood and Plunder is set, being the golden age of sail. And every time, being a history person as I am, I think just because of my background in taking a lot of those classes in college and spending a lot of my time doing the research, I am the guy that sits in the back of the movie theater and mutters under his breath during a Pirates of the Caribbean movie, well, that's not accurate. Now, I know that Pirates of the Caribbean is fiction. It is the most fictional thing you could possibly imagine within the pirate universe. But in movies, video games, TV series, books, every time I see something that's just a little bit out of place, the ship is too big. They don't wear those hats. That guy is not dirty enough. These guys all look the same. I'm that person that's very picky about historical things. Blood and Plunder is the one historical game that I cannot complain about. The aesthetic is so historically accurate. It's honestly kind of shocking. When I first looked at Blood and Plunder, I thought, oh, it's a cool sailing game that's also got land and so on. This looks really cool. But it wasn't until I actually got the models in my hands that I realized how phenomenally detailed and accurate they were. Down to even the appropriate length for the match, like the slow burning match for matchlock muskets. It's fantastic. Again, if this isn't the sort of thing that you care about and you prefer a more pop culture style of pirates and sailing and so on, maybe this isn't the game for you, because you'll look at the ships and say they look small. The ships were smaller. These really big, huge sailing ships just weren't around at the time that this game is currently set. And the few that were, it didn't end well. Honestly, the only real complaint I have about the aesthetic of Blood and Plunder is that, if anything, the models are not visually diverse enough. Like, if I take a unit, like a box of 5 filibustiers, 5 guys, and I look at them, I say, these guys all look very similar. Now, that is because Firelock Games has designed them both to be historically accurate and so that you know what unit they come from. But for me, I'm the guy that looks at them and says, these are almost too similar. I want them to be even more visually diverse to reflect the incredible diversity and randomness that is, well, buccaneering life. Because of that, I don't complain about Blood and Plunder. I really don't. The game is very good. There are some things, of course, in the rules that I maybe don't have the best opinion of, but I can understand why they did it. Again, they have to toe that line between historical accuracy and game balance. They can't go too far in either direction, and they're doing a very good job of towing that line. I'm not going to say, just based off of the strength of my convictions, that anyone should or shouldn't play Blood and Plunder. But, to be perfectly honest, if you like historical miniatures games, and you like the Golden Age of Sail, this is the game that you want to play. And if you only care about the ship combat, you don't want boarding action and so on with actual physical minis, Firelock Games makes a game called Oak and Iron, which is all ship combat. I haven't played it yet, but if they did as good of a job with Oak and Iron as they have with Blood and Plunder, it's gonna be good. The other thing is that Blood and Plunder encourages you to make these incredible boards, these incredible terrain pieces. It's a game that is so cinematic, and I feel like this is kind of the case with a lot of historical miniatures games. You want it to be as vivid as you can, but Blood and Plunder, it just feels like it takes it to another level. Like, because you have rules for like turning houses and so on into fortifications so that you can destroy them, it really does make the environment feel very interactable. And as a result, I feel like because there is so much focus on terrain, how terrain works and so on, that you are encouraged to put a lot of effort into the terrain and make this incredible cinematic experience of a war game. Unless it wasn't already clear, I really like Blood and Plunder. Anyway, I've got to stop before I fanboy a little too hard about Blood and Plunder and make this weird. Or was it already weird? But do you guys like Blood and Plunder? Do you dislike Blood and Plunder? Do you think that I'm crazy? You're probably right. If you think any of these things, or if you think something else, let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon. It helps. So guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.